In this video, I'm going to review the SOMA Grand Randonneur. Don't let the long French word scare you off because it might be the right bike for you. Find out what I think about it in this video. If you're unfamiliar with the concepts of randonneuring and randonneur, basically it is a long-form cycling event. Distances range anywhere between 200k to 1200k in events like Paris-Brest-Paris. During the event, cyclists must stop at various controls or checkpoints. There is a minimum average speed of 15 kilometers per hour, and these events generally don't have winners or a podium. The point is just to complete them. Another big aspect is that you have to be completely self-supported, and oftentimes people will carry a large front bag, hence a randonneuring bag or rando bag. Although you can ride any bike during a randonneuring event, even plastic carbon bikes if you want, there is a particular kind of bike which is associated with that event. Oftentimes steel with some kind of front rack and generally low trail. The SOMA Grand Randonneur is SOMA's attempt to kind of capture the essence of that bike, but with some modern bits. Enough of the history lesson, let's jump into the bike itself. The frame has a steel frame and fork, and it's nicely outfitted with all the mounts that you would want in order to use a randonneuring bag, so you can have a front bag, or you can run rear bag as well as fenders. Probably the biggest divergence from the classic randonneuring bike, much to the dismay of some and the joy of others, is that this bike has more modern standards. Through axle wheels as well as disc brakes. The wheels on this bike are the DT Swiss 1600 with some American classic tires. The brakes are by Yokozuna. They are the Motoko, so dual piston, hydraulic cable hybrid. There's a hydraulic reservoir there, but it is cable actuated for ease of maintenance. Moving up to the cockpit, it has this sweet and awesome looking IRD Drillium brake levers. The shifters are Rivendell down tube shifters run as bar ends. And the handlebar is the Highway 1. So this is a little bit more of a classic road bar, if you will. It is 46 centimeters wide with fairly long reach built into the bar and a deeper drop. The stem is a Nitto Technomic Deluxe. Moving to the drivetrain, this is where things get pretty cool. It is a new crank, the IRD Vortex, which should be released later this year. External bottom bracket uses the 24mm Shimano spindle, and it has a 5-bolt 94 BCD, so you can really set up this crank to your preference. Here it's set up as a 4230, which provides lots of good range when you look at what it has in the rear. It's got an 11 to 40 S-Ride cassette in the back in 9-speed, as well as a S-Ride chain. The rear derailleur is a Shimano GRX 10-speed with a long cage and a clutch. I forgot to mention the front derailleur. If you're looking for a front derailleur that will shift smaller chain rings, this is the Microshift R9. Other interesting things about this bike, if you look at the tubes, they have fairly small diameter tubes. Top tube is 25.4 and it has a butting profile of 858. Down tube is 31.8, also with a butting profile of 858. Not the thinnest tube set out there, but definitely thinner than others. I think thinner than even the Riv bike that I have. The rear chainstay is 430. The head tube angle is fairly steep at 72.5. The rake is 65 millimeters, and the resultant trail with these tires is 41. So it does qualify as a low trail bike. It's not the lowest trail bike I've ever ridden, but definitely lower trail than your typical endurance road bike, which again hovers in the mid 50s to mid 60s. Okay, I know what you're thinking. That is a lot of nerd speak. How does a bike actually ride? First and foremost, this bike was kind of conceived of as primarily a paved road riding bike, although I did take it on our gravel loop because why not? Probably the first thing I noticed about this bike was how smooth and compliant it was. I wouldn't say it was noodly, but you definitely had a softer front end. I think partially due to the quill stem. It just has a lot of flex, which I think is pretty good in this instance. Riding on rough pavement and our gravel loop, it soaked up a lot of the chatter of the terrain. Generally speaking, for me, although it is technically a low trail bike, it rode fairly neutral. I didn't think it was overly responsive or overly twitchy. It basically felt just like a normalish bike. I think when climbing with this bike is when the low trail attributes of this bike really shown. And what that means is during low speed climbs where things are really steep, the front end of the bike doesn't veer off course like a drunken goat. The front wheel does move, but it's constrained to a very small kind of arc, if you will. So this is great when you're tired and you're going on a long ride with lots of climbing. You can kind of relax and just pedal without having to micromanage the front end on the climb. With that 430 rear end, it's not like a super jumpy staccato climber. In my opinion, great climber, balanced, and just enjoy the ride uphill. In terms of going downhill, this is when things get a little interesting. So I'm typically not a fan of low trail bikes going down the chunk. Granted, this isn't what this bike was intended for, but it's what we have in Missoula. I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised. It felt pretty neutral to me when descending. A big part of this could be the tires. It's kind of a wider tire than normal. Typically, most people would probably run a 42, which would then lower the trail and kind of magnify that low trail feeling. But with this larger 50mm tire, it neutralized things out while giving lots of suspension. That's not to say it would be my first choice if I was doing a lot of chonky road descending. I'd definitely probably err towards a higher trail bike, but this bike will do it. A quick note about the quill stem. I know lots of people poo-poo them, you know, they're old tech, old fashioned, whatever. They are kind of a pain in the butt to change handlebars, but every quill stem bike I've tested just feels great going down this chonk. It's like having a built-in suspension stem. Okay, so who is this bike for? Do you have to be preparing for Paris, Brest, Paris to appreciate this bike? At the end of the day, I think this is the perfect road bike for most people. And by road bike, I don't mean a road racing bike. I mean a bike that you're going to ride mostly on roads, maybe a little bit spirited, but you're not going to be contesting the sprint at the end of a race. Smooth, it's responsive enough for me. It's got the mount, so if you want to carry things on super long rides, then it's perfect for that. It really strikes this balance of kind of your endurance road bike and a touring bike. A little bit more emphasis on utility and comfort than a pure, road racing style bike, yet not as heavy and chonky as a full-on, fully loaded touring bike like, say, the long haul trucker. It also has wider tire clearances than your typical road racing bike. So I think for most people, this actually makes perfect sense as their one and only road bike. You could set it up for light touring or put a rack on it and also use it as a commuter during the week. In terms of other bikes like it, I think the closest would probably be the Velo Orange Polyvalent. I found this bike to maybe be the slightest bit peppier and also more neutral handling in the front, but pretty close. I mean, we're splitting hairs here. If you're deciding between the two, you should pick the one that's available, honestly. Okay, so if you're looking for a bike to go the distance, to carry light loads, and that also looks pretty dang classic, then this bike is for you. If you enjoyed this review, found it helpful, learned something new today, please consider supporting the channel by joining us on Patreon or by buying a sticker from our sticker store. That's how we keep the lights on here. No major sponsors, just viewers like you buying $2 stickers at a time. And as always, everybody, keep the supple side down.